Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, I've been thinking a lot about why a certain critique of Biden's student debt cancellation plan has been really bothering me. And I think I finally figured it out. It's because at the end of the day, it reminds me of the very problem that drove me to journalism and then to politics in the first place. Elites criticizing student loan cancellation on the basis that it's helping elites are not only lying to protect themselves, they're weaponizing working class identity to hurt the working class. They're doing weaponized identity politics, and it's wrong. Let me explain. I'm relatively new to Rising, and some of you might not know that my journalism career was actually launched by a critique of identity politics. It was back in 2017, and I was just an anonymous lawyer, but I was being driven crazy by how identity politics were being weaponized to help Democrats peddle some really disgusting ideas. I didn't have a problem with the notion that people who had been discriminated against on the basis of their identity would band together with other people of the same identity background and fight for the rights that they had been denied. That kind of traditional, basic coalition politics always made sense to me, like a legal class action. If a bunch of people are hurt by the same pharmaceutical product or the same faulty brake system, obviously they should band together as a class and fight. But what was happening around 2017 felt different. Identity became more than just a loose proxy for some experience you might share with others. It became increasingly essentialized. Increasingly, people were asked not to consider candidates on an individual basis or to think for themselves. The identity of the candidate was supposed to be enough. Hillary was a woman and thus assumed to be the best candidate for women. And what's worse, the fact that she was a woman was held up as a justification for policy choices that actually disadvantaged women, like her selection of an anti-choice VP. Bernie supporters were characterized as Bernie bros for pointing this out. And feminist activist Gloria Steinem even said that female Bernie Sanders supporters were just doing it for the boys, a statement for which she later apologized. It was almost worse with Kamala Harris. After she was elected to the Senate in 2017, she was immediately floated as the future of the Democratic Party. She was black, she was Indian, she was female, she was a senator, she was attractive. What else did one need? But many progressives and criminal justice reform advocates across the aisle pushed back, pointing out that her record as a prosecutor in California was checkered at best. As I wrote in my 2017 article, while serving as Attorney General of California, Harris failed to prosecute Steve Foreclosure King Mukin after his One West Bank engaged in a notoriously aggressive pattern of home foreclosures. Harris's department found that One West had engaged in widespread misconduct in its treatment of borrowers. The investigators urged Harris to conduct a full investigation and provide a public accounting of what happened. Instead, Harris closed the case, not even pursuing a compromise measure of a civil penalty. Mukin later donated to her campaign. But people who raised this concern, along with her concerns about her punitive approach to truancy, were dismissed as racists and misogynists. As I wrote back in 2017, Neera Tanden, a close Clinton ally and frequent defender of the Democratic Party, said she found it odd that these folks have it in for Kamala Harris and Cory Booker in particular. She said, implying that criticisms of Harris and Booker were racially motivated. MSNBC host Joyanne Reid referred to Kamala critics as alt-left activist, and Brittany Cooper wrote that the left in general, but in particular the Sanders left, has a, quote, black woman problem. What a neat trick to use black people and a superficial advocacy for representational diversity to deflect from actual policies that hurt all the black people who were not named Kamala Harris. I find it difficult to imagine something more unsettling than weaponizing a person's identity in order to shield them from having to answer for how they've hurt the very group they claim to represent through their actions, through policy. So why am I bringing this up now? How does this relate to the topic du jour, student debt? Well, many critics of Biden's plan are doing something similar in my eyes, but this time the identity is working class status. Like Kamala defenders, they claim to have the best interests of working people at heart. At the same time, they push to suppress policies that would help working class people. policies they themselves have benefited from, policies like access to a college education. In her Radar on Monday, Rising co-host Briahna Joy Gray took a stand for the working class, apparently harmed by Biden's student debt plan, citing, quote, first-year corporate lawyers and accountants as the main beneficiaries of the policy. But as she knows, the income caps would foreclose any corporate lawyer from having their debt canceled. Starting salaries for corporate lawyers are well above the income cutoff, and only 0.3% of federal debt holders went to an Ivy League school at all. In fact, 90% of the debt relief will go to those making under $75,000 a year, a huge difference from Trump's tax cuts, 83% of which went to the top 1% of earners. And to get to the top 1% of earners, by the way, you have to earn nearly $600,000 a year. Briahna acknowledged that some of the aid would go to the deserving, but, quote, more of it would go to elites. That's simply not true. And it's not clear why someone would try to demonize a policy that targets people too poor to pay for college without going into debt. And even more troubling, why they would use working class people to do so. I want to be clear. If you don't support student debt cancellation because you're concerned that it's not the most targeted thing to address poverty, I get it. I agree. It's not at the top of my policy agenda, but it is the most targeted thing Biden can do without Congress, e.g., by executive order. That's why we're talking about this right now. Biden can't snap his fingers and make public colleges free, but he can do this. And if you're troubled that student debt cancellation doesn't get to the root of the crisis, I also agree. That's why I've always supported Bernie's plan, which was to use a small tax on Wall Street gambling to fund free public colleges and universities. But what bugs me are the people who are arguing that it's somehow elitist to give poor and working class students a chance at the same opportunities wealthy people can access, the same opportunities that Newsweek editors with graduate degrees can access. Comedian Bill Maher provided another example of elite faux populism recently. A few days ago, he complained about the student debt cancellation policy, but in doing so, unwittingly made a strong argument for college debt reform. Take a listen.
50 years ago, 70% of good jobs required a high school diploma. Now, they say 70% require a college degree. Mm-hmm. So I know this is like supposed to address income inequality, but it kind of does the reverse, because it's the people who have college degrees.
Yeah, but there are also parents of those kids who don't have college degrees who want their kids to be able to go to college so that they can have a better life than they did. And we have to address the cost of going to college. I mean, I'm an old man, but when I went to college, you know, at UCLA, it cost me $242 to go to school for a whole year. Now it's crazy what you have to pay, and it's unfortunate, and it does target the kids that are most in need.
If 50 years ago, 70% of jobs required just a high school diploma, and now 70% require higher education, why would try to withhold aid from people who have responded to that reality by getting an education, and in doing so have fallen into this exploitative trap of the for-profit college industry? Even if you believe that other people deserve relief more, and I would love to pay off some people's trucks, few people argue that students who have had to pay many times more in college costs than generations before them don't also deserve help. A rich kid with rich parents who can pay out of pocket might pay $160,000 for a degree. A working class kid paying off that debt over 10 years at a moderate 4.5% interest rate could expect to pay nearly $40,000 more for the same education. And that's even assuming they could keep up with the $1,600 a month payments. So why, again, the urge to punish students rather than the educational institutions that screwed them? If you want to get at the root of the college cost crisis, by all means, push Biden to do so. Push your elected representatives to vote for legislations to do so. I will. But why try to take away one of the few programs designed to benefit the people hurt by this elite gatekeeping? One of the few programs Biden has the power to enact without needing to get permission from a corrupt Congress. Zachary Carter tackled this question beautifully in a recent article. As he pointed out, this is a policy that targets middle and working class people. 40% of people who attend college are enrolled in a community college. People making more than $125,000 a year are excluded from the program, as is nearly all debt from law, medical, and business school. About half the total write-off will benefit people in the bottom half of the income spectrum, nearly all of it to those in the bottom 4 quintiles. And of course, the government subsidizes middle-class people all the time. It's the central promise of nearly every political campaign. So why all the vitriol over student debt? When we argue about student debt, he says, we aren't really debating credit policy, inflation, growth, or the separation of powers under the U.S. Constitution. All of these avenues of discussion are actually elaborate detours around the central issue, the structure of the American social order. In other words, who gets to be on top? Rob Reiner really hit the nail on the head in the same Bill Maher segment.
Yes, college is unaffordable. It's about making college more unnecessary. It's a giant scam. It's a consumer product that they're selling you as a golden ticket to be in the upper middle class. But they're not really getting any education.
Did you go to college?
Of course.
Of course.
Because that's
and look
what,
at the job you have. You're a big-time guy and have your own show.
Exactly. Bill Maher went to college. He knows that college graduates on average earn more. But despite seeking out an education himself and embracing those advantages for himself, he seems to want a different set of opportunities for everyone else. Look, college didn't used to be a scam when Bill Maher went to school. In the 70s, you really could work a summer job and pay off a few hundred or a few $1,000s in tuition. But what summer job will pay you the $20,000 or $60,000 it takes to graduate from college today? Today, college is still a good deal for the rich, while it's a scam for poor and working class kids who, because of interest, pay more for the same credentials as their rich counterparts. That's driving an income gap wider and wider. And what do elitists like Bill Maher have to say about that? Tough luck, I guess. Elsewhere in the clip, Maher claims that the jobs he says he respects don't really require much in the way of training. Specifically, he points to nurses, saying his mother was a nurse and using her working class bona fides to argue that in actuality, nurses don't need to go to college. I mean, that's an odd sort of stolen valor. Maher's take strikes me as weirdly dismissive of the enormous skill required to be a nurse. Is it populism to diminish the skills working class people worked hard to acquire that enable them to do their jobs? And even if you think nurses shouldn't get training before they, measure out and inject drugs into your veins, it is in fact required right now today. The average nursing student graduates with between $40,000 and $55,000 of debt. Some nurses spend decades paying it off. Is it really elitism to want to help them? And when the overwhelming majority of debtors are people like Carolyn from Arkansas, who after 44 years of nursing is still paying off her Master's of Science in Nursing, is it ethical to pretend that the mere existence of Harvard lawyers who do not qualify for forgiveness justifies ripping away much needed aid from the first responders and from American laborers? Listen to how Ted Cruz describes the working class in this clip.
There is a real risk if you are that slacker barista who wasted 7 years in college studying completely useless things, now has loans and can't get a job. Joe Biden just gave you 20 grand. Like, holy cow, 20 grand. That, maybe you weren't going to vote in November and suddenly you just got 20 grand. And, if you can, get off the bong for a minute and head down to the voting station or just send in your mail-in ballot that the Democrats have helpfully sent you, it could drive up turnout, particularly among young people.
There's a lot going on there, including the implication that it's bad to be easier to vote and making up kind of characters on the internet to be mad at. But principally, a slacker barista? I'm sorry, is someone less worthy or less American or less hardworking or less working class if they work in the service industry versus another field? someone should tell Ted Cruz that the world has changed a lot in the past few decades, in part due to a bipartisan cohort of elites shipping American manufacturing jobs overseas. The average working class voter today isn't a man in West Virginia with a hard hat and a mine. 17% of jobs are in the service industry. Education and health services jobs employ more people than any other sector. So why do people like Bill Maher and Ted Cruz, people whose jobs depend on appealing to a broad audience, feel so comfortable punching down at the people they purport to stand for? At the end of the day, the arguments these elite anti-elitists are making amount to an argument that poor and working class people shouldn't have the same chance to go to college that they did. I don't see any other way around it. Inevitably, everyone arguing against student debt cancellation has themselves gone to college, at least here in the context of this clip and in this show. They have or will send their kids to college. As unfair as it is, they know what social capital comes from going to college, and they're more than aware of the increased earning potential that comes along with a college degree. So why isn't what's good for the goose good for the gander? It's easy to get in front of a camera and call out elites. Some people have made a lot of money posing as populist heroes. But take a step back and really consider, who is fighting for the working class to get access to the same things elites have in terms of education, workplace protections, healthcare, and housing security? And who is just shooting down populist policies? Why do people who claim to hate elites seem to have the very elite education they now want to make nearly impossible for lower income Americans to achieve? Why is it that they criticize elites but never seem to bring up taxes on the rich? Do they only put down policy proposals without proposing alternatives? I'll acknowledge the flaws in Biden's plan. It doesn't go far enough or get to the root of the problem. But the left has been consistently fighting for more. Can faux populist heroes bashing this plan, which again is one of the few things Biden can do with an executive order, say the same? Weaponizing identity politics is pernicious precisely because a marginal identity is being used to hurt the very communities it pretends to protect. You hate it when it's used to insulate Kamala Harris from criticism. Is it any better when elites do it to protect the status quo in which they thrive?
I mean, look, we've discussed this a number of times. I'm on the botcha side of this, and I agree with Bill Maher. I don't think it's this hypocrisy to go to college and also many people who are against this forgiveness went to college, but maybe they made different choices to avoid in where they're going to go and how long they were there and what they majored in to avoid accruing debt or to accrue less debt. Maybe they didn't go to the fanciest, most expensive place. Maybe they tried to finish in 3 years rather than 4 or 5. And this is, look, if you could, it's not about just wanting to hurt people who are in debt, but people agreed to take on this debt. It wasn't forced on them. It was a voluntary interaction. I would like to borrow this money from the American taxpayer, and I will pay it back under these terms. I think this system is bad, and we've talked about this at length. The system should be changed. The college costs need to be made affordable to the people, at least if we're talking about public institutions. That only makes sense to me.
What should Biden do to do that?
I don't necessarily agree that this is that he can. He's sort of declared or thinks that he can. We'll find out if the court agrees that this policy can be done without Congress. I'm not confident that it can.
He's been doing it for 2 years, and Donald Trump started it.
Well, just because Donald Trump did it doesn't mean it's constitutional.
Right, but it's something that's been ongoing for 2 years. So to overturn the precedent of being able to at very least suspend these payments, which is what cancellation ultimately can be, is an indefinite suspension of these payments, then you're going to have to do a lot of retrofitting to the last 2 years of public policy where these objections have not been raised.
Yeah, I don't.
So here's the question. Fine, if you've had these other alternative ways, and I'm sure everyone's thought very hard about how to help working people, what are they?
I've said we should change the whole.
How? And show me the record of having supported all of these policies for years that would get to the root of the issue. Because I can show you, going back years and years, that I have been fighting hard, going to protest, working for campaigns, advocating across this country for exactly those kinds of policies. What I'm noticing
I've been
is that
advocating
a lot of the
abolishing
people,
the student loan program for 10 years.
I'm noticing that a lot of the people who have a lot to say in this instance have done little to nothing from a policy perspective to try to promote some of the alternatives that they are just now throwing out here, just in the one occasion where a couple of dollars are actually coming into the way of people who earn $125,000 a year. We live in a country where Joe Biden—
$300 billion out of that we lent. We lent that money.
It's a tax base that is being paid into by the exact same people who are benefiting from it. I don't own a house, Robbie, but you get to take a mortgage. Well, I don't know if you own a house or whatever, but people who do own homes get to take mortgage deductions up to $750,000 a year on their homes. Do you know what the maximum deduction of your taxes is for if you have student debt?
I don't.
It's only $2,000, and that's only if you make less than $60,000 a year. If you make over $60,000 a year, it's zero. So tell me why.
Probably the taxes are unfair.
Tell me why, Robbie, we live in a country where every Democrat and Republican vows to make life better for the middle class. We have tax break after tax break for the middle class. Joe Biden declares that he's not going to raise taxes, not just on the middle class, but anybody earning under $400,000 a year, an amount that is well over what many people would consider to be just middle class. And there's none of that vitriol and backlash against any of those policies. But the second there is a distribution that is going to be made to people whose parents were literally too poor for them to pay for their education, suddenly we have to say, oh, if you're a middle class person getting aid from the government, you're suddenly a deplorable who's not supposed to be benefiting in any way. And you have people talking about folks that used to be considered the bedrock of our labor class, dismissed by Ted Cruz as though their lives don't matter, their labor doesn't matter, their work doesn't matter, like some work is better than other. I'm sorry, that is elitism. Giving people the same opportunity that Ted Cruz, who went to Harvard, has to get the education that enabled him to have the career that he has and be the millionaire that he is today, that is not elitism. Everyone shouldn't have to go to college.
I think it's elitist to slam working people, baristas. Yeah, Ted Cruz, fine, terrible, bad. But people who don't want to forgive the debt obligations that others willingly took on, that they don't want forgiven because they paid their own way and they took out loans and they made it work, those people are frustrated, and I understand their frustrations.
Well, I'm one of those people. I've paid more to student debt than probably 99% of people in this country because I had a bigger student loan burden than 99% of the people in this country. And I would never begrudge anybody else the opportunity to get out from under their debt. It has been a real mitzvah for me to be able to be in the top percent of earners and to be able to keep up with my debt burden. But unfortunately, as I've witnessed with so many of the people in my life, one misstep, one ill parent, one disability for yourself, one firing because there's a recession and the job market crashes and you are no longer able to keep up with those payments and they balloon. The people who are getting their debt canceled are people who have been paying.
It's a scam, like Mar said. Don't do it. Don't take them out. Right. Don't subscribe to it. Don't do it.
And my position
is
not
worth it.
If you don't have an alternative, if you've never talked about taxing the rich, if you've never talked about ways that you could equalize inequities that might happen on the fringes of this kind of policy by just taxing people who do have windfalls, then you are not a good faith actor. And what you're ostensibly doing, what you're literally doing, is spending all of your time and energy attacking the one policy that Joe Biden can do to actually help poor and working people at the same time that you cloak that objection in a faux elitism. And frankly, I think that's the worst kind of weaponized.
Well, I described a plan in my radar yesterday for what I would do differently. I think if the income-based repayment, I think, is a good plan, but should be done directly with some arrangement with the colleges rather than the government for that.
Proposing plans that are going to be backed by Congress is a bait and switch. Biden can do this.
There's a plan.
Are Republicans going to get on board? Are all the Republicans like Ted Cruz going to vote for legislation? They're not. And I think that Democrats should propose legislation. I said this in my radar last week, that you should bring up all of the plans that the left has already written that are sitting there ready to be signed and voted on to actually fix the root of the problem. But the fact that they have never paid attention to those plans is proof positive that they don't actually care about working class people.
Well, we're talking passages. I'm not defending Ted Cruz.
I welcome alternatives, but people who sit around with their graduate degrees and their elite jobs looking down their nose saying, oh, we should just have all of this sympathy for people who are toiling away and serving me my coffee. The idea that you would say something as elitist as that and pass it off as being a working class hero is one of the more craven, disgusting things that I personally have ever witnessed in the context of this conversation. And that's why I wanted to do this radar about it today, Robbie.
All right, well, you tell us what you think about this subject. We obviously disagree very, very fervently. We'll have more Rising right after this.